Welcome to this episode. The last two conversations I shared on this podcast were in German. They were about a subject very close to my heart, the Oedipus and Electra complexes. And I received questions from people who don't speak German, but who were drawn to the topic and wished there was an English version too. I understand that very well because what we're talking about here goes much deeper than psychological labels or theory. These topics touch on the earliest movements of our lives, our bonding, our orientation, closeness, and the early imprints that shape how we later relate to others, love, and experience ourselves. Today, I have decided to combine these two episodes into one longer conversation in English. It is not a summary, but a full and faithful translation. I'll try my best so that none of the nuances, depth, or meaning are lost. We will explore the Oedipus and Electra complexes not just through the lens of Freud or Jung, but from a more spiritual and energetic perspective as well. Looking at them through the chakra system and the earliest movements in the human nervous system, long before language, thinking, or identity. And I will guide you through this as one coherent story because these two dynamics belong together. So, let's begin at the very beginning of our human experience. Oedipus and Electra complexes.
Welcome to Masculinity Now with Arabella Tornau.
Before we delve into the Oedipus complex, I would like to briefly explain why I'm talking about the chakra system here. In spiritual teachings, the 7 chakras are seen as energy centers that show us how we develop, how we feel, and how we interact with others. They run along the spine from the root chakra at the base of the pelvis to the crown chakra above the head. Each of these centers represents a specific life theme. The root chakra, safety and basic trust; sacral chakra, relationships and closeness; the solar plexus chakra, self-worth and power; the heart chakra, love; the throat chakra, expression; the third eye, intuition; and the crown chakra represents consciousness. They also represent more, but for now, I feel this is totally enough. And when one of these centers falls out of balance, and that is very important, it will later manifest in our emotions, in our relationships, and everyday areas such as money, boundaries, and self-confidence. And through these energy centers, you can often quite clearly see what a person is currently experiencing or where something in their system has slipped out of balance. For example, we can intuitively sense that something is being protected when we see someone walking through life with their shoulders slightly hunched forward. Physical symptoms also tell their own story. For example, a slipped disc in the lower back is often energetically associated with the root chakra and themes such as support, safety, and the burden someone has carried for a long time. In the first months of life, this chakra is particularly connected to the mother. Later, themes relating to the father also emerge because at this level it is always about stability, structure, and inner security. There are a lot of people I was talking to lately, and they have troubles within their lower back, in their disc. And when I ask them more questions about their relationship to their father, it is always, most of the time, really quite clear why or where the root cause comes from that they don't feel stable within their own life. The body always tells the truth through posture, tension, and pain. And the chakras form an energetic map, showing us why certain areas of our body react in a certain way. For this reason, I don't start with Freud when I speak about the Oedipus complex, but much earlier. Freud describes the phase between the ages of 3 and 6 years, but energetically the foundation is laid much earlier, in a baby's first movement, before thinking or speech are possible. So when a baby is born, their journey begins at the root chakra. This chakra represents manifestation, arrival on earth, the body, survival, and the bond with the mother. And a newborn is exactly that. A being that is completely dependent on closeness, warmth, nourishment, love, and safety. They don't live in thought or identity, but in experience, in I am here and I need you so that I can stay. And what we often don't learn is that the soul only enters the body around 4 months into pregnancy. The first few months in the womb are seen as a kind of preparation. The body is forming, but the soul has not yet entered. And after this time, the soul connects with the tiny body and begins to animate it. And I found these teachings are so profound because they can prevent us from a lot of suffering and pain. Because in the case of a miscarriage, a soul may touch the body briefly and then leave again. So in this perspective, a miscarriage or miscarriage in general are not something that must be mourned. They must be understood. The soul that occupied the fetus for this brief moment has already fulfilled its purpose. And according to this view, it is not a mistake, but rather a brief encounter, a small mission perhaps, just a single moment that has had an impact either on the individual or within the family system. The soul needed only this brief touch with the world to fulfill its destiny, and the mother who carried the soul is considered blessed because she held a highly developed consciousness for a moment. After birth, a slow journey through all 7 chakras begins. As we said before, the baby starts in the root chakra, which is associated with the body and survival. Into I am here, I need you so I can survive, into the purely physical, breathing, sucking, being held, and simply surviving. And the first months after birth are therefore all about the root chakra. The baby's entire existence revolves around the mother. There is no thought, there is no identity, there is no I. There is only existence. And if the soul's plan is to remain on earth, the child will stay. Otherwise, it is possible for the soul to be born for only a day. And there is a personal story of a friend of mine because she gave birth to a beautiful, beautiful son. And a couple of months into pregnancy, she realized through the doctors that he has a heart defect. He has a hole in the heart. And it was not quite clear that he would survive the birth. He was happy being in the womb, but it was not quite clear if he also would stay here on earth. And the experience was very hard for her. It was very traumatic and also very liberating because thank God she trusted her inner guidance, and she also leaned before everything happened more into spirituality, more into trust, more into knowing that everything is happening for a reason. And that teaching helped her to realize that nothing belongs to her, nothing belongs to us, and that we can be happy to even carry a soul just for a few month or for a few days or for a few breaths. And we can be considered as blessed. And of course, the journey is always individual. I don't know how I would have felt being in her shoes. I don't know that. But I find the story very moving. And maybe it comes up here on this podcast again because it can help you. Going back to the birth, what happens through the chakra system. So even before the child can speak or think, while they are still breastfeeding, the transition to the second chakra begins. This chakra represents relationships, perception, procreation, and the ability to distinguish oneself from another. It is precisely during this early stage, when the baby is feeding and the world consists entirely of the mother, that a second presence enters for the first time. And it's very important because it is a shadow. It is a figure that the baby does not yet understand but can sense. And this is the moment when the path of girls and boys diverge for the first time. A little girl lies at her mother's breast, completely absorbed in this closeness, while somewhere in the background she senses that shadow. Something in her response. It's not sexual, it's not a thought, it's not anything, it's very quiet. It's more like a deep knowing, a deep sense of, okay, that's interesting. I'm drawn to that. A curiosity, you might say. And this shadow, which she cannot yet identify, is her father. And in a way, it's her first love. And from this early perception, a natural attraction often arises. The early daddy feelings that many people recognize later in life. Daddy little girl, or, all of that, why we, especially for us women, have such a strong emotional bond to their fathers. And this is not because the mother is less important, but because the child's perception widens when she notices the shadow for the first time. And the father suddenly becomes part of her inner and outer world. And the same scene appears for a boy, but from a very different inner program. He too lies there, held by the mother, but as soon as he perceives the second presence, something instinctive is activated. You could call it the alpha principle because it is a deep primal feeling, a silent impulse in the body that says there's someone between me and my world. It's not consciously, it's not a thought, but it's very biologically. Two masculine energies in the same space, and the small body reacts before it can understand why. Interestingly, the father feels the same. And out of this, the first form of competition between father and son emerges. This is a pre-verbal tension that can later manifest in many different ways, depending on how it is resolved. And what I found particularly interesting is that this conflict exists in every human being. The only thing that matters is whether it splits cleanly. That means whether a child is eventually able to truly feel, he is the father and I am the son, or she is the mother and I am the daughter. Whether these inner roles become clear and established. If this splitting does not happen, if the pattern becomes stuck in the unconscious or is never fully understood, a disturbance in personality development emerges, which is later referred to as a neurosis. This causes a small inner displacement that leaves the adult stuck in certain areas, such as relationships, self-image, and how they deal, or we deal, with authority, closeness, or boundaries. This is precisely where the Oedipus complex begins, as Freud later termed it. However, What I learned from my teacher, and what makes a lot of sense to me, is that the true origin lies much earlier. Not only during the period between 3 and 6 years of age, as Freud assumed, but during the first few months of life, when the baby transitions from the first to the second chakra. It is precisely at this time, again, before a child can speak or think, that this early dynamic of closeness, orientation, and rivalry begins. And everything we see between the ages of 3 and 6 years is merely the visible expression of that. And that blew my mind when I first understood that, when I really first felt it in my body. These early tensions, which arise in the first few months of life, shape what Freud termed the Oedipus complex. And when we understand where this conflict starts, we also understand why it has such a deep impact on later life. A little girl who orientates herself towards her father early on has a natural curiosity about the other. If this orientation is later well integrated, she finds her way back through the mother and to her own feminine self, to safety and identification, and to the sense of I am like her, and I am allowed to be different. If this integration does not happen, however, a part of this early orientation remains. Later in her relationships, this can manifest as a desire to be seen by men, idealization, a need for validation, or a quiet distance from the mother. Sexuality often takes on an emotional tone that stems less from adult attraction and more from an early emotional movement stored in the second chakra. For boys, this early dynamic unfolds differently. Again, his initial response to his father is competition, an instinctive feeling that he must prove himself. If this rivalry is later resolved internally and reflected externally, he will find his own masculine identity through his father. Otherwise, the early tension remains, manifesting later as a mindset of comparison, insecurity, struggle with authority, or a constant need to prove himself. This mindset also continues in relationships, often manifesting as a search for support, intimacy, or validation that mirrors what he experienced or also craved in his early bond with his mother. When we observe many men in leadership positions or politics today, we see these patterns reflected externally. We see it in power struggles, on competition, hierarchy, and the need to be right. And these are all added manifestations of an early tension that was never fully resolved. So there is no doubt that our intuitive response when we see some man in politics is basically seeing two little boys are angry with each other, or two little boys are fighting for the need to be approved by their dad. And all of this points to the same truth. It's the fight against the father. But the higher truth is that this is often a fight against ourselves. And once we recognize that, a new possibility arises. And that possibility is one that doesn't begin with erasing the past, but with establishing a new inner stance today. If this inner order does not arise, the adult will continue to search for it in partnerships, the body, sexuality, success, recognition, and patterns of competition. None of this is wrong. Rather, it is unfinished development, a movement that began back then and simply changed form later on. The good news is, though, this order can be restored at any time. It does not require a perfect father, a perfect mother, or an ideal childhood. All that is required is awareness, because unconscious conflicts lose their power the moment we recognize them. Once we understand what happened and what was missing back then, the nervous system can reorganize. The father can take his place inside, the mother receives her place, and we are allowed to take our own place. At that point, the old conflicts loses its power. Relationships become clearer, closeness becomes easier, sexuality becomes more mature. The old struggle between attraction, identity, and competition begins to settle. And again, this is precisely why Freud's explanation begins too late. The phase between the ages of 3 and 6 years merely reveals what was already present beforehand. The true beginning lies at the very start, in those early quiet movements of life. And the female variant of this dynamic, which mainly concerns the bond between mother and daughter, was later termed the Electra complex. And that's what we are going to look at now, because this structure has a depth of its own. As the girl orients herself toward the father, the mother remains the primary figure of identification, the one she mirrors, internalizes, and sometimes quietly pulls away from. And it is within this subtle differentiation happening inside the relational triangle of mother, father, and daughter that the early imprint of what Jung later described as the Electra complex begins. Now, bear with me, have patience, have understanding, compassion, because I probably won't pronounce the names correctly. Anyway, the term comes from the Greek mythology. Electra, and now here we go, was the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. When her father, Agamemnon, returned home from the Trojan War, he was murdered by his wife and her lover. Electra then placed herself unconditionally on the side of her father. She carried the rage, the loyalty, and the grief so strongly within her that she helped her brother Orestes kill their own mother in order to avenge the father. And when I first was reading the story, I was also fascinated when I looked a little bit deeper, because then it also becomes even more clear why Electra became the figure that Jung later used symbolically. Before Agamemnon went off to war, he sacrificed Electra's sister to appease the goddess Artemis, an event that deeply shaped the mom, Clytemnestra. According to the myth, Agamemnon had angered the goddess Artemis, and as a consequence, Artemis stopped the Greek fleet from sailing by sending unfavorable winds. To appease her, Agamemnon was forced to sacrifice his daughter. And when Agamemnon returned from the Trojan War many years later, accompanied by another woman, the seer Cassandra, basically Clytemnestra lost her shit and she and her lover Aegisthus killed him. As brutal as the story is, it communicates something very essential. It communicates the deep, overlay strong attachment of the daughter to the father and the simultaneous hostility toward the mother. A shift that does not arise consciously, but emerges from a disruption in the identification with the mother. And that is exactly what Jung wanted to describe. What happens when a girl inwardly remains with the father, as orientation, as ideal, as an unconscious longing, and the mother becomes the figure she distances from, fights or rejects. If we look at the early energetic movement that I described, the movement from the root chakra into the sacral chakra, it suddenly makes sense, because that is exactly where this dynamic begins. The little girl turns toward the father and the mother shifts inwardly to the side. In a healthy development, the daughter eventually returns to the mother, leans into the feminine lineage, and can say, I am like you, and I am allowed to be different. That is integration. If that does not happen, a tension remains. The mother becomes a rival, the femininity of the mother becomes a threat, or she is completely rejected, and the father becomes overstated, idealized, perceived as someone who can rescue or validate. Freud later tried to explain why girls feel drawn to the father and came to the term penis envy, the equivalent to male castration anxiety. It was his way of saying the daughter feels disadvantaged in her development and seeks something from the father that she lacks. For many, this makes more sense, symbolically speaking, as a sign that the girl is searching for something she did not find in the mother, for example, safety, recognition, worth, or orientation. And if we look at this energetically, it is less about penis envy and far more about the movement in the second chakra. Again, relationship, identity, mirroring. The girl seeks in the father something she did not feel with the mother. And when the mother herself is wounded, insecure, overly critical, emotionally distant, or competitive, this split happens even faster. Just as the Oedipus complex described the tension between father and son, this early competition, the attachment to the mother, and the struggle for attention, the Electra complex describes the tension between mother and daughter. The quiet rivalry, the turning toward the father, and the sense of having to choose between two internal poles. And if this inner movement is not integrated, it can lead long-term to self-doubt, internal pressure, or even the feeling of standing between two worlds. Sometimes also to that familiar mix of self-rejection and the feeling of feeling nothing at all, an inner emptiness. And this imbalance continues quietly. It can also continue in subtle distance or anger toward the mother, in the idealization of the father, in difficulty feeling or embodying femininity, in competition with other women, in the search for male validation that never truly satisfies, in over-adaptation or overly strong independence that is more protection than freedom, and in this deep identity conflict, am I enough? Why does this imbalance arise? You may ask. And here are some common reasons. Emotional distance from the mother. A mother who is not innerly present leaves the daughter feeling unsafe. An overcritical or controlling mother. The daughter distances internally to protect herself. Father as refugee or rescuer. If he feels emotionally closer than the mother, a triangular shift occurs. Unprocessed themes of the mother, trauma, self-doubt, her own mother wounds, all of this is passed on through generations. And my work lays in releasing generational trauma because the imprints are so strong, they can influence our life on such a profound, deep level if we are not aware of them and if we consciously not choose to let go of them. And one more thing, which is also very common, is the idealized image of man. If the father is unconsciously placed on a pedestal, no man can later take that role. And what if the father was not present at all? Then a different imbalance arises. The daughter carries an internal image of absence. She fills this empty space with fantasy. And this fantasy is almost always idealized. At the same time, a pain arises that wants to be seen. And this pain is often directed against the mother, because she was the only one. The mother is then not only experienced as a mother, but also as a projection surface for missing support, disappointment, and everything the father could not give. And from this wound, a rivalry develops that has less to do with actual competition and far more to do with a longing that was never answered. Children do not seek facts, they seek explanation. And when there is none, the nervous system constructs its own, almost always against the mother. And why is it called a complex? It's called a complex not because something is wrong, but rather because something remained unfinished. The natural development would be turning toward the father, returning to the mother, identification, integration of the feminine, own identity. If the return to the mother does not happen, the daughter remains energetically stuck with the father. And then exactly what later appears in relationships emerges. Men are idealized, the daughter seeks in men what can only be healed within herself, worth, recognition, identity, and grounding, inner safety. Women become rivals, closeness with men becomes intense, closeness with women becomes difficult, and the own femininity feels unsafe. How is this complex resolved? Jung says through identification with the mother. I would say through awareness, integration, emotional maturity in the nervous system and inner order. It does not require the mother to have been perfect. She never needed to be. Like I said before, we don't need the perfect mother, we don't need the perfect father, and we don't need to have the ideal childhood. Actually, it's impossible to have, because otherwise we would have not evolved, we wouldn't have grown. And there's this sentence in my mind popping up from my teacher that says, we think that the world owes us something, but the world is not here to save us. It's here to burn away everything that we are not, until only truth remains and remembrance. And going back of that, it requires that the woman today returns to what was missing back then. A safe place in her own body, in her own home, a clear identity, the permission to be a woman, the ability to heal mother's themes without falling into guilt or shame. And the inner movement, I am not her, and yet I come from her. That is the moment in which the Electra complex dissolves. Only then does the daughter become free to be a woman. And the relationship to herself and to others becomes more real, more honest, and more mature. And exactly there something begins that goes far beyond complexes, neuroses, and old tensions. A life that no longer arises from adaptation or internal battles, but from a clear inner truth that has finally found its place. And the same goes for men as well.